Chapter 26, Act 26, The Lunarian's Tale. Act 26, The Lunarian's Tale, The Sorcerer's Prayer. Baron, the morning of the moon's return. That morning, for the first time in many years, maybe even since Theodore had been born, Cecil and Rosa did not rise for the day together. When the first stirrings of sunlight danced over her eyes, Rosa rolled over, a sleepy moan escaping her lips as she wrapped her arm around Cecil's taut torso and curled her body deeper against his, entwining their bare legs. She could hear the steady rush of his beating heart through his arm, and when she opened one eye, she spied the alabaster curve of his neck exposed beneath the spill of his silver hair, sorely tempted to press her lips to the bend just below his jaw and revel in the flutter of his pulse. A trail of delicate red marks that ran down to his collarbone, hidden beneath the rest of his hair, gave witness to her resistance failing her spectacularly the night before. She felt a warm ache in her hips as she remembered the way the light of the full moon, and nothing else, had illuminated their bodies with a depraved luster as they had fallen into bed. But the moonlight's enchantment had been broken with the inevitable rising of the sun. There was much to prepare for today. Theodore had only been gone one short night, and he was expected home mid-morning. Cecil had been nothing but adamant that their son would come home a night, but even a king's work did not stall for such a day, which meant the majority of the celebration planning had fallen to her shoulders. She didn't mind it, but she could already feel herself breaking out in a sweat at the last-minute errands she would have to coordinate, including the unenviable task of fetching her mother from town and confessing the news of Theodore's rather sudden decision to recruit. Rosa and her mother had never agreed on much, including her own decision to fight in the war 17 years prior and to marry what Rosa's mother felt, and probably still felt, if you asked her after a bottle of Bacchus wine, was the inferior of the two men clamoring for her affections as a youth, but their relationship had taken a welcome turn for the better when Theodore had been born. Once Rosa had become a mother herself, she had started to understand Joanna Farrell's constant state of worry and what the stress of having your heart exposed on the outside of your body in the form of a child did to one's psyche. Both of them fiercely loved Theodore and wanted him to live a life free of strife, or at least as much as one could that was the sole heir to the most powerful kingdom in the world. So, it could go without saying that her mother would be as displeased about Theodore's hasty decision as she had been, and she was bound to get a shrieking earful about it. But at least Rosa had had 24 hours to somewhat come to terms with her family's new reality, not that that meant she still wasn't shaking with the fear of every possible thing that could go wrong. By the time darkness had fallen in Baron the night before, she was a tempest of nerves and despair. No wonder it had been so appealing an idea to surrender to Cecil's happiness and give her body a few precious hours to forget. "Cecil," she whispered, sitting up and gently shaking his shoulder. "Time to wake up." He parted his lips, an inaudible groan escaping as he pressed his fingers to his forehead, slowly raking them up through his hair. "What time is it?" "It's later than usual, I'm afraid," Rosa frowned. "There won't be much time to get ready if we don't hurry, and I'm sure the baths are already getting cold." He finally rolled over and rose to face her, and she felt an involuntary shiver run down her spine as his eyes fell to hers, luminous, and the same cerulean blue as their planet wrapped in moonlight that Rosa had observed hidden away on the lunar whale. She could see her flushed, kiss-swollen lips curling into a smile in the reflection of his irises. He brushed his thumb over her cheek, curling his fingers into her hair as he lifted her mouth to his other hand trailing over the curving silhouette of her breast. "Cecil," Rosa mumbled into his mouth, the urgent insistence of his lips lulling her eyes shut. "Ah, if time could only stop now. I would be so happy." After a few moments, he pulled away, offering a small smile. Rosa tilted her head, her fingers aimlessly tracing the shallow line of muscle that trailed just below his navel. "You go on ahead, Rosa, I'll go in after you. My head feels as if it's spinning." "Oh," Rosa blinked, squeezing his hip. The blissful afterglow of the morning shattered, and she was promptly deposited back into reality, a slightly drafty bedchamber in Baron where technically, their son could walk in at any given moment. They were running really late, now. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, I think so." Cecil looked over his shoulder to the window, and Rosa saw a muscle in his jaw twitch. "I just had the strangest dream. I'll tell you about it later." "Sounds good," Rosa smiled, kissing him on the cheek before slipping out of bed. He turned away from the window, his breath catching in his throat as he watched her push up on her toes to reach for her cerise satin dressing gown, her shoulder blades jutting with effort as she shrugged her arm into one sleeve, and then the next. The gauzy skirt of the robe fell over her backside like a curtain at the end of a play, and she reached under her collar, tugging out the layers of her hair that had spilled from the pile of curls she had kept plaited in a messy top knot yesterday. Just as she was about to cross the suite to the chamber across the hall that held the baths, Cecil shook himself from his trance, the sheet sliding from his lap as he started to get up, his voice shaking.
Rosa.
She turned slightly, smiling as she wrapped the robe across her chest, not bothering with the laces for the short trip. She hadn't heard the distress in his tone over the list of chores she was mentally cataloging.
Keep resting, dear. I've just remembered we'll have to fetch your armor as well, so I'll make this quick. It should be waxed and buffed up and ready to go. All right. Thanks.
The door slammed shut behind her. Cecil sat back down at the edge of the bed, propping his elbows on his knees and cradling his head, his hair tumbling over his shoulders as he hunched over. A sharp throb tore across his temple, the pain taking his breath away while his stomach contracted involuntarily. She looked as if she were about to sprout wings and vanish. When Rosa returned, she found Cecil kneeling on their bed, dressed in a black cotton shirt and matching leggings, his arms folded on the ledge of the picture window that held him aloft. He was gazing outside, the gossamer white curtains shoved aside as to not impede his view. Rosa had been about to announce that the bath was free, but hesitated when she realized he had not heard her come in. He never turned to acknowledge her. As she came closer, she spied what had instead caught his undivided attention. Last night's full moon was still hanging high in the morning sky, like a newly polished pearl unearthed from the depths of the starry seas of outer space. Cecil's eyes were distant and searching, his pupils shrunk in pinholes and his lavender pink-lined lids heavy with grief and exhaustion. He had taken a total 180 from his ardor of yesterday. He had been so excited to see Theodore off on his trial and have his son finally take an interest in something that he had been practically walking on air the entire day, and more so eager to get Rosa to come around and share in his enthusiasm when they were reunited that night. The first true full moon of the summer, Rosa thought, combing her fingers through her wet hair as she came closer, her bare feet padding silently across the freezing cold stone floors. Another year has gone by already. Ever since Cecil was dispatched to steal the crystal of water 17 years ago, the passing of our lives became denoted in summers. That terrible night was when the war begun for us. She had approached his bedside that night, just the same as she was doing now. Back then, it had been his room, and not theirs. And he would try once again to push her out of his life forevermore, heartbroken that the man she loved had now become a murderer in the king's name. She could envision the ghost of her past self begging Cecil to refrain from his next mission, a naive 19-year-old woman who had no idea that life as she knew it would be destroyed in the 12 hours that followed. Her dark night had ignored her pleas, hypnotized by the light of the twin moons. Cecil, your lunar birthright was calling to you even back then, wasn't it? My heart still aches for you at just the thought of the confusion you must have felt deep within. Being by your side has taught me that even time does not heal every torment. She climbed onto the bed behind him, pressing her bare skin to his back as she wrapped her arms around his waist and perched her chin on his shoulder.
Looking for him again?
He nodded, his stare not leaving the moon. Rosa leaned in closer, her breath tickling his ear. He was a million miles away, she could feel the warmth of his body beneath hers, and the shallow cadence of his breath contacting in his chest, but his heart had been cast into the far reaches of the universe.
I wonder how he is faring.
We never say it. Your brother's name. Neither his given name, or his true name. Finally, Cecil lowered his gaze, reaching down and placing a hand over hers.
So do I.
Time for a change of subject, Rosa thought, her stomach churning. Having been alone in the bath with her thoughts, her mind had gone back to Theodore's whereabouts and whether or not he had survived his trial. She decided now was a good time to distract Cecil with further selfish placation so that at least one of them was somewhat functioning by the time the Red Wings came home.
Do you think Theodore is safe?
Cecil turned to face her, and she slunk off his back, her knees sinking into the mattress. The light had begun returning to his eyes, igniting the sapphire undertones that stopped strangers in their tracks, had made her insides fill with butterflies since the very first time they swept over her, had been gifted to their only precious child. Finally, he was coming back to her, drifting back to the orbit of their blue planet. His lips curled into a pained smile.
I wouldn't be concerned. He has Biggs and Wedge with him. But still.
Rosa began, and he pressed a finger to her lips, shaking his head.
Listen, Rosa. You need not worry for Theodore. I know this all seems very sudden and frightening. Like we went to sleep with the sun we knew but then awoke the next day with another. To us, he's still a child, but the reality is, he's a young man. You and I were his age when we also started to take charge of our lives and quietly resisted our elders' wishes, remember? But you've raised him well, you've blessed him with the compassion, wisdom, and courage he is going to need to thrive both within and outside Baron's borders. And that's why I'm not worried, it's because you are his mother that I know Theodore understands.
Rosa stared at him blankly, mumbling against his finger. Her robe slid down her arms and halfway down her back as she shifted her weight.
Understands what?
He felt another spasm ricochet in his head, this one far more powerful than before, and had to blink away the stars that had exploded in his vision. Rosa's voice was disjointed and sounded like she was calling to him from underwater. He had a terrifying vision of the floor suddenly opening beneath her, obsidian, nightshade-tipped claws tearing at her white flesh and dragging her into a smoldering hell. Cecil suddenly pulled her into him, his hands sliding down her uncovered back as he closed his eyes, digging his fingers so tightly into her that she could feel the knots of stress that had taken residence in her muscles depressing under his grip. It was a strange mix of relief and yet more pain. She let herself melt beneath his hands, resting her head against his chest and sinking into him as she felt his heart undulate powerfully against the hollow of her cheek. He pressed his mouth to her hair, willing the sugary sweet lemon scent of her bathwater to banish the last remains of the painful nightmare that had taken him as he had fallen asleep last night. He could still hear the ringing of steel echo in his ears when his blade, Ragnarok, had plunged into the dark armored chest of his adversary, a spray of crimson blood drenching his face as he hungrily watched the light drain from hauntingly familiar violet eyes. Lowering his head, he whispered in her ear.
That destiny is something you create for yourself.
Agart. The scholar stifled a yawn as she flipped the page in her notebook, her hand blindly feeling for the coffee she had just brewed in the tiny kitchen below the observatory. It was nearly the end of her shift, just one more hour, and she was free to crawl into one of the cots Corey would lay out for his interns in the darkest corner of house. He had even hung up blackout curtains, which turned out to be a fabulous investment in terms of his interns not quitting nearly as often as they used to. She scribbled the date and the time, an ungodly hour, in her opinion, after being up all night, and took a sip of her coffee before rolling her stool back to the unwieldy telescope that was the star. Corey liked making stupid puns about space. A lot, of their observatory. She made a couple adjustments to the focusing wheel and the eyepiece before settling in, her eyes trailing over the same old familiar star patterns that had been ushered in with the summer season. She scribbled some notes in her book, adjusting the position of the scope and turning toward a new quadrant.
Oh my!
She suddenly jumped up, screaming with abandon so that her voice would carry down to the first floor.
Corey, sir! You have to see this!
There came pounding footsteps, and Corey materialized at the top of the stairs, a piece of toast hanging out of his mouth.
What's all this racket for? The moon, sir.
The scholar blinked.
Just take a look for yourself. What?
Corey bit off a piece of the toast and tossed the rest on her desk, ignoring the look of disgust she gave him. He slid down onto the stool, hunching over the eyepiece and chewing silently. The scholar knew the moment he saw what she had, because a distinct gagging sound garbled out of his throat, and the chewing of the toast suddenly ceased. Moments later, a big lump of soggy bread traveled down Corey's throat. It wasn't just the moon, the more apropos description from the scholar would have been the moons. To reach any other conclusion from what he was seeing was superfluous. There was no doubt that a second satellite was creeping out from the mass of their planet's moon. It was smaller, but only by about half as much, from what he could estimate visually. Corey barked for the scholar to grab a collection of notes from one of his bookshelves, rambling off a volume number that she didn't bother to double-check. He had every single page of his observations and the observations of his students over the past 30 years catalogued and memorized in a complex library he kept in the observatory portion of the house. She fled to the bookshelf, pushing up on her toes to reach the volume in question, and ran back to his side, her glasses askew.
Go to page 98,
Corey said, his eye still glued to the scope. As he had been observing, he had swiped her notebook that had fallen to the floor, his fingers flying over the page as he sketched out his observations without ever looking down. She turned the pages until she reached 98, and found that it was simply a large sketch of another moon. Underneath were a date and a time, only a week and 17 years off from today's date, coincidentally, and in chicken scratch handwriting, definitely not Corey's meticulous scrawl, was the label Red Moon.
What do you think when you compare these?
Corey asked, pulling away from the scope and holding out the notebook. The scholar leaned in, not able to mask the impressed look on her face as she took in Corey's rushed, but detailed sketch. Her eyes flicked back over to the notebook she was holding in her hand, and frowned.
Well. For starters, the new moon has a lot fewer craters. That's the most obvious difference. But if I look at the notes about scale here for the red moon...
She trailed off, her eyes scanning some numbers scribbled, almost like an afterthought, at the corner of the page.
It seems as if the red moon was also dramatically smaller. Unless the new moon is closer to us in orbit and that's why it seems so large.
She closed the notebook, shrugging. She was going to need more coffee if she was expected to do any further number crunching after being up for 12 hours.
So to answer your question, Sir Corey, my initial thought is that these are two different celestial bodies. The red moon left our orbit nearly 17 years ago, right? I don't think it is back. It's unheard of for a satellite object like that evolve so drastically in such a small amount of time.
To her surprise, he nodded thoughtfully, closing the book in his hands as well.
I agree with you 100%,
Corey frowned, chewing on the end of the pen.
So my next question is... what is this moon, if the red moon is still unaccounted for?
The paladin's footsteps clicked inauspiciously against the immaculate crystal tiles, an azure and ivory cape sweeping the floor in his wake. His lithe physique was reflected 100-fold throughout the hallowed hall, on the hand-cut crystal chandeliers that crawled across the ceiling like the sprawling branches of the Tree of Life, each stem dripping in shimmering icicles that gave the impression of rain suspended in mid-air, the two-way mirrored walls, which revealed the moonscape and the darkness of the sky outside, punctuated with chasms of starlight, and the sculpted diamond-laced pillars that ran the lengths of the palace. Halls. Cecil paused before the glowing crystal dais, his hand hovering over the white gold hilt of his sword. His mouth was set in a thin line, his eyes narrowing and silver-threaded brows lowered as he took in the towering stance of the man blocking his way. The muscles in his forearm contracted as his fingers gripped the blade.
Cecil.
Golbez was standing between two pillars, the prisms behind him swathed in a sea of black that not even Cecil's sacred light could pierce. His voice echoed maddeningly inside his helmet, and he knew the confines of the ebony-stained adamant made his shout of surprise sound much more threatening than was his intention. Even so, he hesitated to remove it. Cecil's cerulean glare was drilling daggers into him, and he was terrified at what would happen if even an inch of his flesh were to be exposed to his brother's intensifying rage. He might catch holy hell and spontaneously combust right then and there in the middle of the Crystal Palace. It's unbelievable, how much he looks and moves like Cecilia. It's as if she's been reborn. Golbez took a step forward, raising his black-gloved hands high in the air in surrender. Suddenly, the weight of his armor felt unbearably cumbersome, like the gravity levels of the palace had been sent into overdrive. Just those few actions had him reeling. The darkness. It has become asphyxiating. It won't be long now. But I just need a little more time. Cecil snarled in reply, dashing forward to close the distance between them. His crystal blade was a prism of rainbow light as it caught the sheen of the chandeliers above, smashing into Golbez's stomach before he could teleport away. The strike knocked the breath out of him even with as much of the impact his armor had absorbed, and he fell to one knee, biting his tongue to keep from crying out. Cecil exhaled sharply, his silver hair falling in his eyes as he slammed his foot into Golbez's chest, knocking him onto his back and planting his moonstone-plated boot square against his throat.
Wait. Cecil, stop.
Golbez rasped.
There's something you have to know. Then you can do whatever you feel needs done.
Cecil laughed bitterly, licking the top row of his teeth as he applied more pressure with his foot, bending down to take hold of one of the massive horns curling from Golbez's helmet.
Nothing you can ever say or do will bring them back.
Cecil cried, and Golbez heard the sickening crunch of his larynx being crushed.
Tella. Anna. His Majesty. Edge's parents. Mother and father too.
He gave one last fierce pull, and Golbez's helmet broke free from its clasps, unmasking him as Cecil tossed it to the side. He was staring down at him wild-eyed, the azure rising sun emblem on his breastplate heaving with each name he spat.
Our parents. I didn't.
Golbez wheezed, lifting his gaze.
I couldn't. You were the only one that could have saved them.
Cecil screamed, raising his blade above his head. There was an explosion of starlight, and Golbez felt something heavy plunge into his breast, probing all the way down to his spine. Cecil's face flickered above him frenziedly, his vision was short-circuiting, like one of those mechanical abominations he had once held sway over in the Tower of Babel. He heard a wet sucking sound, and then came the rush of heat scorching his lungs. The last thing he saw was Cecil's face hovering above his own, his pale pink mouth and snowy complexion stained with a spray of blood the same color as the red moon. Golbez's eyes flew open, and it took him a few moments to realize that the screams assaulting him in his pod were coming from his own lungs. He clenched his jaw shut, sliding down into the uncomfortable, but refreshingly chilly metal pit that made up his bed in an attempt to curb his heart from exploding out of his chest.
Was that just a dream?
He whispered. His hands flew to his chest, which was no longer encased in the heavy black armor, nor was it harboring a festering stab wound. Instead, he felt only bare, sweat-dampened skin as his fingers traveled down his pectorals to his abs and hips. He stopped when his hands hit a swath of fabric wrapped around his waist, his mouth twisting in confusion. When did I take it off, that infernal shroud? I know it was right before I went to sleep. But when was that? How much time has passed? As his eyes adjusted to the dimness of the pod, he realized he could make out his reflection in the glass lid above. Next to him was a long leather scabbard, the scarlet hilt of a sword was obvious against the silver bed. A black cloak was draped from his neck, the only other item he was wearing that could pass for clothing besides what he could now see was a knee-length kilt hanging from his waist. His moonlight-streaked dark silver hair trailed to the middle of his tanned back and chest, an esoteric juxtaposition of light and dark that you would not normally find in the Lunarian race. Of course, he was only a half-breed. Someone that neither belonged on the Lunarian's moon, nor the blue planet. Staring back at him morosely from above were his father's eyes, deep violet, with flecks of scarred gray where shadows of darkness had once resided, taking the form of a queer amber glow before he had been awoken from his malice by the Lunarian sorcerer named Fusoya. Kluya, his father, had been Fusoya's younger brother, which made his savior his very own uncle and one of his last living blood relatives. Fusoya had gone to sleep with him as well. He would be somewhere in this chamber, hopefully dreaming of something far less terrifying than his nephew had. Of course, a blood-soaked nightmare was the smallest possible price Golbez could have ever paid for his transgressions. Decimal dust, really. Had Cecil been standing over him at that very moment, he would have readily pressed the release for the glass shield protecting his body, and let Cecil transform the pod into a coffin. Golbez closed his eyes, recalling one of the last conversations he had had with Fusoya before he had come face to face with his final, for the time being, resting place.
Do you dream, once you are in stasis? Ah, yes, perhaps more powerfully so than the people of the blue planet. The dreams of a Lunarian are the result of the psychic impulses that have evolved with the centuries' worth of mana that flows through our veins. When Zemus was in stasis, he dreamed as well. Of course, you witnessed the end result of that when he tried to destroy your home planet. He is the extreme of all that is malevolent. The people you see sleeping all around you now are simply having innocent dreams that they are eager to live out once it is our time to awaken.
Golbez opened his eyes, his fingers brushing over the release for his pod. There was a melodic whirling noise, and the glass slid cleanly away from him, retracting into the pod space. My dream is to forever be purged of this darkness, to rid the stain in my heart that allowed Zemus to use me for his bidding. The nightmare with Cecil? Is my brother telling me that I will only achieve salvation through death? He swung his legs over the side of the pod, his bare feet hitting the smooth, but frigid crystal tiles beneath him and grabbed the sword, swinging it over his right shoulder. Glittering faintly beneath the tiles were hundreds and hundreds of stars. The core of their sleepy moon actually consisted of several layers of dimensions that were protected by warp time and space, and each of those stars was a glass pod with a slumbering Lunarian within. Golbez and Fusoya slept on the first and highest level as the Lunarian's guardians. The unoccupied pod Golbez had taken over had been his father's. Kluya had never gotten to use it. Golbez supposed it was the Lunarian intuition he was supposed to have in spades that led him to where Fusoya slept. He crossed several rows of pods containing people of all ages and types, men, women, plenty androgynous enough that he couldn't tell, children, babies, people like Fusoya that seemed as ancient as the universe itself. Every single one had escaped the great cataclysm that had stolen their planet from them ages ago, resulting in their journey to find a new planet to call home. They had found the blue planet, but initial investigations by the Lunarians' leaders, including Fusoya and Zemus, had determined that the people of the blue planet were not yet evolved enough to live alongside the Lunarians. There was too much that was different between the two races for either side to adapt, and war would surely be on the horizon if the Lunarians were perceived as an invading threat. Zemus had wanted to take the planet for their own anyway. His stance was that if they were the more evolved people, it was their birthright. Fusoya and the majority of the Lunarians, however, had disagreed with that sentiment. Their conflict would ignite a wretched scheme on Zemus's part that would plague the lives of countless innocent souls on the blue planet, the catalyst of it all a single Lunarian's audacity to fall in love with a human girl. Golbez's feet instinctively stopped at the base of a pod that was tucked away in the dead center of the chamber. But when he peered through the glass inside, he was shocked to see that it was already empty.
Fusoya?
Golbez asked aloud. Of course, no one answered him. He pushed the hidden emergency release for the pods that resided on the outside base and leaned over, pressing his palms to the metal bed. The red and white prayer beads he had strung around his wrists clicked against each other as he moved his hands to several positions before standing up, satisfied. It's still warm. It's only been recently that he's left. But why did he wake up too? Golbez felt the first fluttering tremor when he left the lunar core where his people slept. It was sudden, but subtle. It felt as if someone had tugged a rug out from beneath him so fluidly that he barely had the time to get disoriented. He could feel the contents of his head shift ever so slightly, and then came the throb of ruby light, and it was over. Tch, Golbez grunted, righting himself as he took a look around. He had emerged into the lunar subterrane, the name Fusoya had given to the maze of tunnels and valleys that were erected deep beneath Moon's crust. It had been the path the Lunarians had dug out gods only knew how long ago to seclude themselves so that they could go into stasis, safe from the terrifying monsters that ended up roaming the Moon's surface surrounding the Crystal Palace and the unknown behemoth that had destroyed their home planet. Fusoya had led Golbez to the Moon's core when they had confronted Zemus during the war. At the time, Golbez hadn't really focused on his surroundings or the path taken. He had anticipated that one way or another he would not be making a return to the surface. But now, when Golbez took in the dead, dusty, twisting path before him, he realized he remembered their journey a lot more than he had thought. The air was crisp, sterile, and made him feel as if ice crystals were prickling in his lungs with each breath, exactly the same as before. The corners of the caverns and ceilings of the tunnels were still draped in the same black-purple shadows a small, fearful part of him longed to shrink into. The floors were covered in a blanket of silver dust and bone fragments that settled into the veiny grooves of the ground like spider webs. He could see the outlines of 5 distinct sets of footprints making their approach to where he stood. Surely, they belonged to his brother and his friends from when they had chased after Fusoya and himself to the depths of the Moon's core, where Zemus had been waiting to destroy them. Cecil and the others were the last ones to enter this horrid place, Golbez thought, taking care to step around the footprints. He wanted to preserve them. They were a monument to the fleeting reconciliation he and Cecil had had before Cecil went back to the blue planet, and he had decided to stay behind on the Moon and sleep. I took the coward's way out, didn't I? I could see it in Cecil's eyes. I denied him what he needed most, even if he didn't realize it at the time. Is that why he's visiting my dreams now? To finally claim the revenge that is rightfully his? Golbez rounded the corner of the first tunnel, plunging into a narrow corridor that took him northbound toward the carved stone steps leading to the next level of the subterrane. Even though Golbez didn't see evidence of Fusoya's prints in the dust, he still strongly suspected his uncle had come this way and had started his climb back to the surface. Fusoya didn't walk so much as glide everywhere. Golbez had never been sure if that was something all full-blooded Lunarians could do, or just Fusoya. The floating thing didn't seem to run in the family. There were a lot of questions he had had about his heritage that he had never gotten to ask. Everything had happened so fast in between the time he had awoken and when he had confronted Zemus, and failed. If Cecil hadn't reached them. Golbez shook his head, staring at his shaking, sweat-streaked hands as he walked. I can feel something. Not just Fusoya's presence. A palpable fear. Like I can reach into the air and grasp it with my fingers. He followed his little brother's footprints into the reaches of the subterrane, not realizing he was holding his breath until his lungs had ruptured in flame. The Red Moon, 48 years prior. The young man pressed himself up against the wall, his eyes trained on the small crowd that had gathered around the crystal dais. Their voices had carried all the way outside, so he had at least been alerted to their presence ahead of time. Sliding his bare feet across the glossy tiles, he had just nearly made it across the corridor to freedom when he heard a firm voice call out his name.
Kluya.
Not an exclamation, and not a question, just a simple, clipped statement that was enough to make the hair on the back of his neck stand straight up. He turned around, plastering an overcompensating grin on his face as the crowd around the dais parted. His older, much older, he was apt to point out, brother, Fusoya, descended from the dais, where he had been watching the crystal as the crowd talked around him. Kluya often caught his brother gazing upon the crystal's light. It was the only crystal they had managed to rescue when their planet fell under attack. Their comrade, Zemus, had risked his life to steal it away onto their escape ship, and it had become the unofficial symbol of hope for those of their tribe that had survived, even after the startling discovery that the moon they had created to orbit the blue planet had 8 crystals of its own. Fusoya nodded to Kluya, who paused in place, glancing down at his reflection in the floor. Fusoya then raised his hands toward the others, smiling genteelly.
A moment alone with my brother, if you would. Fusoya, wait.
A man in the crowd exclaimed. He was tall and willowy, his skin so pale that it glowed a soft blue in the light of the crystal, his shaved head cloaked in a massive black silk hood. He took a step forward, grabbing Fusoya's arm so forcefully that Kluya let a growl slip from under his breath. He knew his brother could take care of himself, but that didn't mean he liked it when anyone got rough with him.
This discussion isn't over yet. The boy can wait.
He cut Kluya a side eye, which Kluya returned by smiling even more forcefully.
It is over, Zemus,
Fusoya said softly, placing his free hand over Zemus's clenching grip.
Or rather, it has been for quite some time. The construction of the vessels that will put us into stasis are nearly complete. This moon will provide us a safe place to sleep, and this crystal palace we've erected will protect the new crystals in our stead. When the time is right, we will join the people of the blue planet. This is my final say on the matter. But who gave you the authority?
Zemus cried, shoving Fusoya away and throwing back his hood. His saffron eyes were narrowed to slits, his navy blue lips set in a thin line.
This is what we narrowly escaped with our lives for, to be put into a moldy dungeon to rot for the next 500 years while we wait for this planet's weaklings to play catch-up? Does anyone else comprehend how ridiculous this sounds? Lord Zemus, temper yourself.
A woman cried, stepping between him and Fusoya.
This is what all of us want, it's the wish of the majority not to start a war with the people of the blue planet. We'd be no better than the monster that destroyed our home if we did that. What Lord Fusoya was saying before must be true, there is a higher purpose we are to serve if we've managed to survive thus far. And sending innocent people into the frenzies of war is not that purpose. Grr.
Zemus spun on his heel, his cloak cracking behind him as he stormed away wordlessly, plunging into the rear crystal chamber in a flash of black light. Fusoya paid the murmurings of the others no mind as he strode purposefully toward Kluya, nodding toward the eastern tower which he had originally been trying to sneak into. Kluya sighed, falling in step behind his brother as they silently made their way up the stairs. At the top of the tower, Fusoya pushed into the silver-etched glass doors that opened to a small veranda. It was only wide enough to fit the two of them. Kluya slid up beside him, pressing his palms into the chilled crystal-encrusted railing as he stared at the opalescent blue marble hanging in the black skies above.
Kluya. Be it that I am happy to see you in such bolstered spirits as of late, you know what I'm going to say, right?
I do, Kluya said softly, his eyes never wavering. Fusoya's eyes, in turn, never left Kluya. He took in his younger brother's inky navy hair. It would have blended in with the surrounding atmosphere if the crystal palace behind them had not been illuminated. He had started to grow it out, it had been closely shorn when they had fled, and now it was already past his ears, brushing the nape of his neck. He had started to grow a beard, too. It was still just shadowy stubble, but everything had finally filled in. He had been barefaced the last time Fusoya had seen him. But something else had changed as well. The light in his violet eyes had come alive like a supernova. Fusoya could see the pulse of another heart, distant as it was, reverberating in his gaze.
I know the blue planet holds a fascination for you, little brother. And your expeditions there have been enormously useful for the Lunarians, all of the data, your candid observations, the willingness to introduce the people of the blue planet to magic. But you've seen in person what the rest of us have speculated for quite some time now, that more evolution needs to take place before we can fully integrate ourselves. Right. Yes. You're right,
Kluya replied.
But aren't you going to lecture me for sneaking off again? No, I know you're just trying to prove Zemus wrong, in your own way, trying to bring awareness to the fact that the people on the blue planet are in fact, people, no different than you and I. But I'm afraid your efforts are lost on him. I suspect it might take a little more than reason to reach him at this point. But why? He's afraid. I can sense that his heart is clouded by regret. He's lived in a state of perpetual despair since we fled. He lost everyone he loved. He feels that all he could manage to save was a worthless piece of glass. He just wants to feel like the sacrifice was worth it. That's why he's so eager to colonize the blue planet.
Kluya leaned over the railing. The moonscape below looked to be hundreds of miles away from their position in the highest spire of the Crystal Palace.
But we lost our parents. And so many other people lost everything as well. Zemus isn't alone. Far from it. There are souls hurting on the blue planet too. I've met so many. A lot of them could be helped with our magic.
He finally turned away from the image of the blue planet in the sky, and looked into Fusoya's watery blue eyes. It's too late, Fusoya thought to himself as he caught his brother's gaze. He's staring right at me, but his heart is a million miles away. Something else happened on his latest visit. Fusoya cleared his throat.
Do you really think it's wise, going to live among them, Kluya?
Kluya blinked.
What?
But Fusoya could tell by the way his little brother's pupils darkened that he had hit the nail on the head.
You would be the only one of your kind. If something happened, I wouldn't be able to reach you. If your ship broke down, it might be many, many years before their technology would evolve to the point where you had any hope of fixing it. You could be stranded there for the rest of your natural life.
Fusoya shook his head, his white ponytail swishing over his robed shoulders.
Which, I may add, we're not sure how long would actually be on the blue planet. We haven't gathered sufficient data on the flow of time compared to our planet. We only know for sure that at least one part of that planet has a very chaotic continuum, the plane the All-Father Bahamut's Eidolon subjects reside in.
Kluya shrugged away these minor details.
Would that necessarily be a bad thing, to be the only Lunarian there? Wouldn't it be best if we did have someone on the blue planet to keep an eye on things? To be there if Zemus did decide to act irrationally. Zemus is still one of us, and he deserves the benefit of the doubt.
Fusoya shook his head.
To make such arrangements when your very life is at stake for a hypothetical situation is what I would call the irrational act. What are you thinking, Kluya? Just come out and tell me.
Kluya again gazed up at the blue planet.
I'm a man of science. It's natural for me to be curious about our new world, right? Everything there captures my imagination, the wildlife, the cities, the people.
He trailed off, a slight smile forming on his lips.
Some far more than others.
Fusoya tilted his head, watching the slow blush climb up Kluya's cheek.
Who is she?
Kluya didn't skip a beat. His voice took on a dreamy lilt.
Her name is Cecilia. Her eyes, brother, as soon as I came upon them, I felt as if I were home again. They are the same brilliant blue as the planet itself. I feel like I'm looking at her right now.
Fusoya followed Kluya's stare, pressing his lips together. The blue planet was beautiful, it was undeniable. He lacked his brother's imagination and scientific curiosity, and could hardly comprehend what it must be like on the planet's surface. He wondered if Kluya meant home, as in their former planet, or if his heart had already pledged itself to this new celestial body.
And this Cecilia knows what you are. Yes, I told her right away. My hand was a bit forced, I used magic to save her from a pack of monsters. That was quite a while ago. I met her one of the first days I began my exploration of the planet.
Fusoya shook his head.
And the plot thickens. And she's all right, with everything she has seen thus far? You've been seeing her since that day. She accepts me for who I am,
Kluya smiled.
She didn't even bat an eye when I told her about our people's plight. Do you know the first thing she said when I was done with my tale? She asked what she could do to help us. She's an orphan, just like you and I also get the impression that she does not hold a high station in her homeland. She lives in a rich city-state that values wealth and the correct bloodline above all else, both of which she seemingly lacks, at least according to the standards of her peers. But despite being told she has nothing to offer society, she still wanted to know how she could help me, an alien wanderer who can offer her nothing in return. It sounds like she has a selfless heart,
Fusoya finally smiled.
I can see why you are so taken by her. But there are considerations that should be taken into account, yes? Long term, we don't understand the ramifications of.
Kluya shook his head.
Brother, please forgive my selfishness. But I've known since the moment I first set foot on the blue planet that I wanted to be part of its evolution. It's not like Zemus, where he wants to take it all for his own. I just want to live among them, observe and integrate, help them evolve so the rest of our people can get out of stasis as quickly as possible and start living again. And, now that Cecilia has.
He trailed off, looking away as he mumbled to himself.
Cecilia has what?
Fusoya prodded. When Kluya didn't respond, Fusoya touched his shoulder. Kluya flinched under the touch, but raised his voice to at least be barely audible.
She's fallen pregnant. With my child. So, you understand why I have to go back, right? This is unprecedented.
Fusoya drew in a sharp breath.
Kluya, do you understand the gravity of what has occurred here? That child, it will be neither Lunarian or human, should it or Cecilia even survive gestation. Please tell me that this wasn't your idea of an experiment that you dragged this poor girl into. It wasn't.
Kluya cried, spinning around to face Fusoya. His eyes were rimmed with red, his nose screwed up in mid-grimace.
I would never. It was an act of love, with intent as pure as the crystal's light in this very palace. Neither of us meant for this to happen, but it did, and I won't run away. Cecilia, the baby, and the blue planet, they are my future now. Perish the thought,
Fusoya sighed. He felt bad for making the suggestion that Kluya harbored ill intentions, perhaps Zemus's needling was getting to his normally placid state after all. How long had it taken them to finally get to this point where they felt safe enough to sleep away the remainder of their journey to a new home? The end goal was tantalizingly being dangled before them, but Kluya was anxious to jump ship now and take his chances. He claimed he was different from Zemus, but Fusoya felt that perhaps they had more in common than Kluya wanted to admit. But hadn't his little brother always been like that? Wasn't that why their parents had forced Fusoya into going after Kluya when he had tried to rescue them instead?
We'll be fine making it on our own to the escape hatches. You have to find Kluya. He's too reckless, he'll get some crazy idea in his mind that he can fight the Planet Eater on his own. Drag him kicking and screaming if you have to.
Fusoya winced at the memory. It had been the last time he would ever see them again, he hadn't even gotten to shout a goodbye before he was forced out of the collapsing house. But I can't follow him this time, Mother and Father. My place is here, with our people. The Lunarians have charged me with watching over their sleep. Kluya doesn't know yet, but I don't think I can bring myself to tell him. He would be racked by guilt if he knew that he had total freedom while I remained on guard here. Although I am happy to do it, he would see it as an imprisonment, and would ultimately choose to stay with me out of loyalty. I can't do that to him, especially knowing what I do now.
Are you angry with me?
Kluya asked, and Fusoya blinked, his daydream shattered.
No, of course not.
He suddenly drew Kluya into a tight embrace, intense enough to make his little brother squirm in discomfort. Kluya had never been much of a hugger and had been shy most of his life, so it was still a little hard for Fusoya to believe that the man had gone full steam ahead and given life to a zygote. And yet, here they were, the second time in such a short while that their lives were irreversibly altered. But this time, the road they had been traversing together had become forked.
Forgive me, I don't want us to part on bad terms. This surely is your destiny? Who am I to oppose fate? You have my unfettered support. Thank you, Fusoya.
Kluya exclaimed, finally returning the embrace by awkwardly resting his hands on Fusoya's shoulder blades.
But don't act like this is goodbye. I'll have the lunar whale, and I'll keep her safe and out of sight so I can come back. You'll want to meet your niece or nephew, right? Of course,
Fusoya smiled. Kluya smiled back hesitantly, pulling away.
The baby. It will be okay. Cecilia is strong and determined. In that respect, she's just like any other Lunarian woman. I know. I shouldn't have said anything to the contrary. This will not be the last time I would have benefited from your optimistic streak, brother. The light in your eyes. It's positively brilliant to behold. It's nice to see at least one of us finally grasping onto a mote of hope after everything that has happened. I just can't believe it.
Kluya turned away, his stare once again drawn to the glowing blue marble hanging in the horizon. Fusoya could see twin blue planets reflected in his brother's gaze.
I'm going to be a father. My son or daughter is going to be the bridge between two peoples, the truest affirmation that we can coexist as one race. It's nothing short of a miracle. Even someone as stubborn as Zemus will understand the importance of this child's birth, if not now, perhaps someday.
The lunar subterrane. The higher Golbez climbed, the stronger the pulsing ruby light became. He lost track of how much time had passed, hours or years, there seemed to be no difference at this point, and his hunger pangs and burning thirst had long ceased, despite his not eating or drinking anything to relieve them. He propelled himself forward with the conviction of a devout, only mildly concerned that the light had seemingly scared off all the monsters he had remembered stalking the subterranean passages in droves. When he at last reached the silver-plated room that would transport him to the Crystal Palace, he found himself completely embraced in the scalding red light. Shielding his eyes as he peered into the depthless chasm above, he swore he could hear distant whispers calling to him.
"It's definitely coming from the Crystal Palace up above,"
Golbez muttered.
"Who else could be here besides Fusoya and myself?"
He crossed over the rune before he could change his mind, and teleported to the surface in a flash of white light. When Golbez's vision finally came into focus and the world around him stopped spinning, he stumbled forward off the rune he had teleported onto, trying to collect his jaw from where it had promptly hit the floor. He was surrounded by a circle of 8 daisies that were spread throughout the mirrored chamber, the home of the crystals of the Red Moon. The last time he had entered this chamber, before he had been put to sleep, the crystals had shone with moonlight and were a rainbow of colors that made blinding prisms sail throughout the chamber. But now, something had gone horribly wrong. The source of the menacing red light was the crystals themselves, giving the chamber the same effect as the sight of a merciless massacre. Golbez walked up to one crystal, hesitantly reaching out and stroking the crimson surface with his index finger. He let out a hiss of pain as he reeled back. The heat of the light was emanating directly from the crystal's core and burned to the touch. If he stared closely enough, he could see the surface of the crystal vibrating with unbridled power. The crystals. They're the color of blood. Watching his fingertip rapidly swell, the skin white and taut against the impending blister, Golbez stepped back, silently summoning a blizzard spell into his hand so he could drown his finger within and numb the pain. He took a slow lap around the chamber, his trembling reflection shining back at him eightfold as he inspected each crystal, all the same sickly hue, all humming steadily with overflowing energy. A feathery soft voice whispered in his ear as he approached the final crystal, gasping and popping like a death rattle. "It has come. The object of our search. The light. At the end of the winding path. The dark dispel. Ing light. Must be unlocked. They were created. The crystals. Alone. They are infinite. The rightful ones, floating in the void. The right. Full. Possessor. Waiting. Endlessly. The great secret, sequestered. The history has been recorded. It must be revealed."
"What? What the hell is this?"
Golbez covered his ears, trying to drown the persistent voices as they rode down his spine like trails of ice water.
"The crystals. Are they speaking to me?" "You noticed, I see."
Golbez whirled around toward the new voice, which sounded much closer and decidedly much more human. He watched as Fusoya entered the crystal chamber from the rear, through a doorway that he knew would lead to the Crystal Palace proper from his last visit. His uncle looked exactly the same as he had when they had parted ways to go to sleep. His ankle-length white hair, the majority of it receded as far back as his crown, lifted itself from the floor in delicate curled tendrils, his matching white beard brushing over the stomach of his purple and blue ombre robes. The only distinguishable feature of his face not hidden by his beard were his sky-blue eyes, which always had the look of a too-diluted watercolor that threatened to bleed through the page. Equal parts confused and relieved, Golbez approached Fusoya, his brow furrowed as he slowly lowered his hands from his head. It appeared that for now, the voices had stopped. Had Fusoya done something to quiet them?
"Fusoya. You were aware of this?"
Fusoya glanced at each of the crystals, a barely detectable sigh emitting from the depths of his beard.
"For not much longer than you, I imagine. When I awoke, you and the others were still fast asleep. I thought perhaps I was the only one who could hear the crystals' cries. But I haven't been up here long, you must have been right behind me."
His gaze returned to Golbez, and a small smile made his mustache twitch.
"It is a happy, but not entirely unexpected, surprise to me that they were able to reach your heart, as dire as the situation before us seems to be."
Golbez rested his hands on his hips. So, it was a good thing that he could hear all these maddening voices?
"What do you think the crystals are trying to tell us?"
Fusoya shook his head.
"I can only guess. Something is happening here. Something that is beyond all of our understanding. The crystals know this, but they don't know how to explain to us in a way we can comprehend. Something powerful is blocking their energy, too. They've gone haywire trying to reach us." What could have happened to our moon while we were in stasis?
Golbez whispered.
How long did it take to get this bad? Not long, I'm afraid,
Fusoya frowned.
All of this is very recent, you and I would have felt this presence long ago had it been lingering. It's been 17 years since we fell asleep, you know. What?
Golbez cried.
Surely, that can't be. It feels like I just closed my eyes mere hours ago. Nearly 17 years to the day, precisely,
Fusoya added nonchalantly. He pressed his lips together, and Golbez noticed that his foot was tapping, but it wasn't hitting the floor, he was floating again.
My sleep had been dreamless until today. I dreamt of the crystals soaked in blood before suddenly waking up. Did you have any dreams, Golbez? A nightmare, specifically? Cecil, he.
Golbez shifted his gaze away, and Fusoya nodded thoughtfully.
I see. Please don't be alarmed, not every dream a lunarian has is a premonition. And what of a half-lunarian? Doubly true, I imagine. Of course, I suppose your brother would be the one to best help answer that.
Golbez could hear the echo of his teeth grinding as his jaw clenched. 17 years.
My investigations only took me as far as the remainder of the Crystal Palace,
Fusoya said gently, deciding that a change of subject was in order.
While I was in one of the spires, I spotted an unsettling sight to the west. It appears to be some sort of scorched crater, nothing that is familiar to me at all, so I fear it may correspond with what the crystals are trying to warn us of. Will you come with me? Of course,
Golbez frowned.
There's no way I can go back to sleep after all this. But will the others be safe? The crystals will protect them in our place,
Fusoya nodded.
Of course, we can't be gone for very long. Understood.
Golbez took one last look at the unchanging crystals before following Fusoya out, his heart hammering in his chest. For a second, he swore he saw a cerulean eye blink at him from the crimson-stained depths, squeezing the air out of his lungs before closing and fading away. Mother? Cecil. The Red Moon, 7 months after Cluya's departure.
You can't make me do this. If you don't unhand me this instant, I'll...
Before Zemus could break free of the 2 other men who were struggling to bind him, Fusoya raised his staff, cracking him across his bare skull with one steady thrash. Zemus's eyes rolled in the back of his head, and he slumped forward, nearly dragging the 2 men down with his weight.
Is he down for the count?
One of the men huffed, stooping down so he could swing Zemus's arm around his shoulder and slowly rise back to his full height.
How could he have resisted all of our magic?
The other cried.
Stop, slow, hold, none of them took. He must have some sort of protection on his person,
Fusoya sighed, lowering his staff. He was thoroughly disgusted with himself for what he had just done, but he had been left with little choice. He could see the pure, unadulterated rage building in Zemus's eyes. It would have been only a matter of time before Zemus had done something foolish, like take out the entire Crystal Palace with a meteor spell. The final day of the Lunarians' wakefulness had come upon them. Every member of their population, accounting 2 for new births, had been built and secured a vessel in which they would enter stasis and sleep for what was now confirmed to be an indefinite, indeterminable amount of time. With the exception of Fusoya, Zemus, and a few others, everyone had already been escorted to their designated pod and had begun the new leg of their journey. Fusoya realized now that he was foolish to harbor any hope that Zemus wouldn't continue resisting until the very bitter end. That morning he had been awoken by Zemus storming into his chambers with another laundry list of excuses as to why he should not sleep, and he had taken to using Cluya as his trump card, thinking that he was the one person that would make Fusoya change his mind.
You haven't heard from your brother in well over 7 months, what if he's hurt, or worse, dying in a gutter somewhere? I understand why you can't leave, but let me go to him in your stead. Cluya is fine,
Fusoya had growled. Zemus only knew half of the truth. After Cluya had departed, Fusoya had decided to keep the existence of Cluya's future heir a secret. It was true that Fusoya had not heard a word from Cluya since the day he left, but it had been because he had begged Cluya to never make contact with them, unless an emergency absolutely necessitated it. The more Fusoya had thought about the ramifications of Cluya's union with Cecilia, the more he feared just what exactly it was Zemus might do. He had observed Zemus becoming more twisted and obsessed with the idea of taking the blue planet for his own as Cluya idly dreamed of his permanent departure, oblivious to the storm that was brewing under his very nose. The tamest scenario Fusoya thought of was Zemus taking a page from Kluya's book and trying to sire an heir of his own to use as leverage. The worst scenario, which often had him waking up from his own screams in the middle of the night, was Zemus hunting Kluya and his new family down like dogs to spite Fusoya, and then taking the blue planet with their heads hanging from his belt.
But I can't feel his presence anymore.
Zemus had smiled sickeningly, his pointed tongue sliding over his lips as he pressed a palm to his chest.
Even when he was gallivanting about on his missions, I could tap into his life force. The mere distance between our moon and that planet cannot dampen my psychic powers. And as his brother, I know you can't feel him either, so why do you continue to live in denial?
Because I ordered Kluya to close himself off from us, Fusoya thought deep in his heart of hearts, where even Zemus's incredible psychic abilities could not reach. Because I realized that if he is truly to live his new life, he must completely be severed from his past. As long as you continue to resist our people's dream, Kluya is no longer safe. Zemus had thrown another fit and left. Fusoya thought perhaps, since even his Kluya argument had failed, that perhaps he would give up and go quietly into stasis with the rest. He had been wrong, optimism did not suit him, it turned out. Zemus was waiting for him when he approached the crystal dais, and he had taken the 2 remaining men that were helping Fusoya hostage, threatening the lives of the other already sleeping Lunarians if they escorted him into the lunar subterrane. Luckily, Fusoya had been able to intervene just in time before any spells had been slung against the innocent.
I'll take him down by myself,
Fusoya offered. He waved his staff again, casting a float spell on Zemus's still body that lifted the burden of his weight off of the 2 men. He hung in the air listlessly, his chest steadily rising and falling like a sleeping child.
It won't be enough just to put him into stasis, I'll have to invoke the power of the crystals themselves to seal him in the deepest part of the lunar core. He's become a hazard to our mission. Lord Fusoya, are you sure about this? You don't have to go alone, let us help.
But Fusoya had never been sure of anything in his life. For once, he reckoned he knew what it felt like to be his little brother, to know so deeply the path to take that the cosmic map was practically burned into his retinas. As the moon's guardian, he would use the crystal's light to end Zemus's cruel ambitions once and for all. A couple of 100 years of slumber still might not be enough, but it was a start. He had dragged Zemus's floating body throughout the lunar subterrane, stopping just before entering the lunar core so that he could frisk Zemus for any dangerous items he had intended on sneaking away with. Sure enough, his suspicions were confirmed. Zemus had planned on causing some major damage if he were by some miracle able to convince Fusoya he needed to go to the blue planet. He had stolen a large number of weapons from the meager armory they had managed to take along with them when they had made their great escape, including a holy lance, a holy sword, and a pair of katanas. He had also stolen the only 2 ribbons the Lunarians had salvaged, sacred relics that shielded the wearer from a multitude of magic, and if used properly, could render a sorcerer like Zemus invincible. Fusoya stripped him of his stolen goods, dumping them unceremoniously on the ground before pulling Zemus deeper underground. Later, he would return and find a way to secure the weapons in the lunar subterrane. With the Lunarians asleep, he wanted to keep such dangerous items out of the reach of any invaders that may come for them. He could defend his people with magic, if it came down to it. Once they reached the heart of the lunar core, Fusoya muttered a spell under his breath to teleport Zemus and himself to the lowest, deepest dimension of the twisted space-time he had molded into chambers of sleep. But this layer, in particular, he had not been planning on using. It was desolated, immersed in darkness, and just unstable enough that there was a modest possibility that anyone left here long enough could be lost in space forever, should just the right conditions be met. But for Zemus, Fusoya decided to make an exception. He chanted another spell, this one causing a small, swirling black hole to open in the ceiling above them, from which a pod from the layer above was promptly pulled through and deposited at Fusoya's feet. He waved his staff, Zemus's body following the flow of Fusoya's movements and crashing into the pod. He then jammed the end of his staff into the mechanism inside the pod that would have allowed someone to open it from the inside. A pathetic buzzing noise fizzled into the dead air as a delicate curl of smoke crawled out of the hole Fusoya had gouged out. He pressed the outside release, and a glass dome slid closed, sealing Zemus tightly inside. Just as the dome clicked into place, Zemus's eyes snapped open, and he let out a furious howl, slamming his fists into the glass and letting out a string of curses. Fusoya stepped back calmly, his expression blank as he grasped his staff with both hands, raising it into the air.
Lunar crystals, I beseech you, seal this dimension with your holy light, and grant infinite slumber to those who reside within. You can't do this.
Zemus roared, and Fusoya watched from beneath hooded lids as Zemus frantically reached into his massive mantle, searching for one of his stolen weapons, no doubt. When he realized they had all gone missing, he slammed his fist into the glass so vigorously that for a moment, Fusoya feared the glass would break apart and rain at his feet, but the pod held strong, merely vibrating with a loud twang. That made Zemus's knuckles blossom with blood as he pounded over and over again. Streaks of the blood began to drip down the inside of the glass, pockets of red that pulsed against Zemus's flashing yellow eyes.
"This is for the best, Zemus,"
Fusoya said sadly. He hated this, all of it. Zemus would never understand that Fusoya's heart was shattering in his chest, watching the man he had grown up with, who had once done so much for their people before the unthinkable had happened, suffering so tremendously. His power and charisma had been unmatched, he could have easily had a hand in carving out a beautiful future for both the Lunarians and the people of the Blue Planet, if only he had been patient enough to let that future come. First Kluya, and now you. How many more people I care about am I to lose before this is all over? As the crystal's light began to gently fill the room, idly drifting over Zemus's pod and dancing over his skin, which was now plumb with rage, Fusoya felt a sudden rush of fever push through him, crawling up his legs and exploding in his chest, a veil of white drawing over his eyes. Startled, he stumbled backwards, dropping his staff with a crash that could barely be heard over Zemus's screams. This presence. It's not Kluya. But it feels so much like him that it hurts. Like my heart is being clutched in someone's fist. He closed his eyes, quivering shadows dancing behind his lids like the reflections of a fire off of a cavern wall. A wail of a child reverberated in his skull, and his eyes popped back open. Kluya's child has been born? That feeling? It the birth of a new Lunarian? He had become so enraptured by his impromptu daydream that he hadn't noticed Zemus's sudden silence until after a few moments had passed. Collecting his wits, Fusoya leaned down, grabbing his staff and using it for leverage as he hesitantly approached Zemus's pod. His summoning of the crystal's light had nearly expended all of his energy. Had the strange surge of adrenaline not filled his core moments ago, he figured he would be flat on his face on the floor. Zemus was laying peacefully in his bed, his eyes closed and hands crossed over his chest, like he was in eternal state of prayer. Fusoya let out a shaking sigh of relief, letting his arms drop to the glass dome as he sank to his knees and let out a single sob.
"I'm sorry, Zemus. I hope that someday, you'll forgive me. May the crystal's light show you dreams of the exquisite future we all deserve. With time, it will be ours, and we'll share it with the people of the Blue Planet. I know it's possible, Kluya has shown me it is, but you and I just need to wait a little longer."
Fusoya stayed by Zemus's pod for a few moments longer, offering prayers to any gods that would see it fit to hear them. He realized that this would be the last time for a long while that he would ever be with anyone again. Once he escorted the last two Lunarians that were waiting for him to their respective sleeping pods, he would be very, very alone, the last remaining soul on an otherwise lifeless satellite. It was humbling to feel the rush of fear seizing his limbs as he struggled to pull himself up from the floor and teleported away. He was sure it was the very same feeling Zemus had experienced in his final moments awake. The corner of Zemus's mouth tugged up in a small smile as his consciousness began to slowly sink into warm, bubbly oblivion. I can feel it. A powerful new soul has just emerged from the life stream. So far away, yet I can sense him as if he were standing right beside me. Ah yes, Lunarian blood rages through your veins. Of that there is no doubt, diluted as it may be. Keep your heart innocent and open, little half-blood. No need to hide it away, is there? Grow strong and true to your potential. I will heed Fusoya's advice after all, and exercise patience. I guess he was right. It will be wonderful to have such an exquisite future to look forward to. And you will help me achieve it faster than I could have ever dreamed. End of chapter.